Hi everyone, welcome to this video. Today we're diving into one of the most common concepts in JavaScript, callbacks and promises. By the end of this video, we're going to understand what callbacks and promises are. We are going to also see how they handle asynchronous operations and know the different benefits and pitfalls of each. We're also going to be able to refactor a callback-based function using promises. So with that being said, let's begin by understanding what callbacks are. A callback is just a function that gets passed into another function as an argument, and it is called when something is done. This is usually something asynchronous like loading data or reading file. Now let's go to our editor to see an example. So we basically declare the function which is named fetch data. It is going to take one argument, which is the callback function. And the intention of this fetch data is this will perform some asynchronous operation and then execute the function we passed in the callbacks once that operation is complete. And for the set timeout, this is a built-in JavaScript function. It is used to execute a provided function once after a specified delay. So here we specified in seconds. So we are going to basically log this statement promise vs callbacks after 2 seconds. So basically our program was defining the function fetch that stimulates an asynchronous operation by waiting 2 seconds using the set timeout. So after the delay, it is going to execute this callback function that was provided as an argument. The program then calls the fetch data, providing an anonymous function as the callback. This anonymous function receives this promises vs callbacks as a string, and then it later on is going to print it after 2 seconds in our console. And here we have promises vs callback as our string that we passed into the callback function. So this basically demonstrates an asynchronous pattern using callbacks in JavaScript. But callbacks can become a mess when you start nesting them. That's what we call the callback hell. Let's see an example. So the above nested example represents the chain dependencies. So basically these codes show a sequence of operations where the result of one asynchronous function is needed to initiate the next one. Like for example, the login user authenticates the user and then calls it back with a user object. The get user takes the user ID from the previous steps and fetch the user's profile, calling it back with a profile object. Again, the get user post then uses the profile ID to retrieve the user's post and finally call it back with the post data. This quickly becomes hard to read and debug. That is where promises comes in. Promises. A promise is an object that links producing code and consuming code. So this is like a placeholder for a value that will be available later. Instead of passing a callback, we can return a promise. Promises give us a .then and .catch to handle results or errors. Let's go back to our editor to see an example. The defined fetch function stimulates an asynchronous operation using the set timeout. So inside the fetch function, a new promise is created. After 2 seconds delay, the promise is resolved with the message promises are better. The fetch function is then called and the then method is used to specify what should happen when a promise resolves successfully. So in this case, it is going to display promises are better. And then we include also the catch method to handle any potential error that might occur during the asynchronous operation. Although here there is no explicit rejection that happened in this example. So as you can see, this is much more cleaner than using callbacks. And we can also chain multiple operations in a more readable way. For example, and as you can see, this is an improvement over the nested callbacks in terms of readability, maintainability, and error handling. So the use of the then chaining clearly shows the sequential flow of asynchronous operations. In the single dot catch here at the end of the handling errors from any point in the chain. To conclude the key differences between callbacks and promises, we have seen that for the callbacks, we can only handle errors manually, but for promises, we use the .catch block. And also, the callbacks get messy fast due to the callback hill in terms of readability than the clean and chainables for promises. Also, last but not least, we can also talk about the control flows. For the callbacks, they are nested, but for the promises, they are linear and predictable. Like here, everything is so linear. So in final analysis, promises helps us write cleaner, more maintainable code, especially when dealing with multiple asynchronous operations. Now, next, we are going to see how one can refactor a callback to a promise. So we're going to refactor this to introduce a promise. Let's see how this can be done. So first, we are going to introduce a promise which resolves For this translation, we basically, inside the getData function, we created a new promise. The executor function of the promise takes the resolve function as an argument, and then, similarly to the callback function, the set timeout stimulates 1 second asynchronous operation. After the delay, instead of calling a separate callback, the resolve function of a promise is called with the data. So this signals that the asynchronous operation has completed successfully. So that's it, callback vs promises in JavaScript. See you in the next one.